Growing up in Fort Worth, camping wasn't something we did for fun. The idea of going into the wild just to battle mosquitoes seemed absurd. It wasn't until I left for university that I discovered the joys of camping. During my 4 years at the University of Central Texas, I transitioned from being a city guy to nearly a survival expert. Then something happened that left a mark on my love for the outdoors. Like I mentioned earlier, nature and I never really got along before I moved to College Station. I'd constantly run into spider webs, and if mosquitoes were hungry, they'd feast on me. You get the idea. By sheer coincidence, I ended up rooming with a guy from East Texas, a place near Lufkin. He had grown up around the woods, and some of his friends from home were attending the same university. They'd spend breaks camping across the state. When my first spring break approached, they invited me to join them at Lake Trinity, a renowned spot for bass fishing. I wasn't eager to spend the break in Fort Worth, and I wasn't in with the crowd heading to the coast. So I figured, why not? With no prior camping experience, I relied on their advice. I borrowed, bartered, or improvised all my gear. The one thing I didn't cut corners on was insect repellent, and bug spray and I became close friends. To my surprise, that trip turned out to be life-changing. Covered in bug spray, I finally got to enjoy the experience. After catching my first fish, I was hooked. Pun intended. From then on, I became a regular on every trip for the next 2 years. That summer, I even got to see the ocean for the first time. In my free time, I would wander around College Station, a university town that still had a small-town vibe. I became familiar with every tree and animal track in the area. I spent many warm months practicing my newfound skills at nearby Sam Rayburn Lake. Eventually, I knew more about the outdoors than my East Texas friends. People back home in Fort Worth said they barely recognized me anymore, but I didn't mind. I had found my place in nature. But as much as I'm still connected to nature, something happened that may forever keep me from returning to the woods. It was spring break of my final year. By this point, some of my camping buddies had either dropped out or transferred. A few of the guys were still around, but we weren't as close. I had planned a big trip to a well-known state park in the eastern part of Texas, though I won't mention the name here. It's a beautiful place, but what happened there still haunts me. Before I left, I was warned about overly eager hunters. However, it wasn't hunting season, so I wasn't too worried. After a quick check of my gear, I hit the road for the 3-hour drive. I arrived at the campsite around 3 p.m., set up everything the way I liked, and decided to take a short walk before dinner. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. I didn't actually see anyone, but the sensation never left me. I cut my walk short and returned to camp. While there weren't any bears in the area, I'd read some stories online, and the thought of being someone's dinner on my first night was unsettling. I ate dinner and went to bed after dark. The night was uneventful. The next morning was perfect. The air was crisp and refreshing. After a quick breakfast, I set off for a hike with a small day pack. The woods were quiet, aside from the occasional sound of a snapping twig or rustling leaves. I didn't feel like anyone was nearby. Around 11 a.m., I stopped for a snack, leaning lazily against a tree while I waited for my stove to boil some water. I must have dozed off because I was startled awake by a mosquito biting my neck. After swatting it away, I noticed a flash of movement in the distance. It was brief, and I wasn't sure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But a crow's caw reassured me I wasn't alone. At first, I wasn't scared, but it was unsettling. Why would someone be watching me? After a while, the crow flew off and I relaxed again. Since my mysterious observer hadn't shown themselves, I figured they weren't a threat. I continued hiking for another half hour, but the feeling of being followed didn't go away. Whoever it was didn't seem to care about staying quiet either. There was a persistent rustling of leaves behind me. Then, a strange odor hit me. The forest suddenly went silent, and I froze. Something was wrong. Despite my instincts, I walked toward the smell. After a few steps, dirt kicked up near me, followed by a loud crack. I turned just in time to hear another shot ring out. Realizing I was being fired at, I hit the ground and stayed perfectly still. I tried shouting, hoping the shooter would realize they'd made a mistake, but there was no response. The forest sounds slowly returned, giving me the confidence to stand up again. I brushed myself off, but the smell lingered, drawing me closer once more. Within seconds, more shots came from the same direction, and I took off running. For the next 10 minutes, I sprinted through the forest, praying to make it out alive. Couple more shots rang out behind me, but I didn't look back. Eventually, I slowed down, exhausted. I hadn't heard any gunfire in a while, but I wasn't going to take any chances. After drinking some water, I continued my escape at a slower pace. By the time I reached my camp, I was desperate to leave. I packed in a hurry, not bothering to put out the fire properly, something I would never normally do. I didn't want to report the incident to the authorities, fearing they'd ask me to return to the site. But as I drove away, guilt crept in. What if another camper stumbled onto whatever I had? About 20 miles from the park, I stopped at a police station and made a report. The officer didn't seem too surprised and suggested it might have been an overzealous hunter. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation fit. If it had been an accidental shooting, the gunfire should have stopped when I called out. The officer assured me they'd check it out, but I didn't expect to hear back. I didn't care. There was no way I was going back. A little time passed, and life returned to normal, but that terrifying day lingered in my mind. Then one day, I came across a story online. A hiker had stumbled upon a hidden marijuana field, protected by armed men. The hiker barely escaped with his life. While I didn't want to believe it, the story struck a chord. It didn't matter if it was true or not. After some time, I accepted that my days of camping were over. Almost a decade has passed, and while I'm still connected to nature, I haven't returned to the woods. The fear is no longer about what might happen. It's about knowing what could be out there. Now, I'm content with my memories and the knowledge I've gained. I still feel the call of the wild from time to time, but it's not the same. The forest, once pure and beautiful, has been tainted for me. The things that people do out there have left their mark, and I can't see the woods in the same light again. My childhood was anything but steady. After leaving my dad, my mom dated a string of questionable guys, and she even let a few of them move in. When I was about 15, she married a man named Steve, whom she met at the bar where she worked. Steve was a total jerk and tried to replace my dad's role in my life, but failed. Mom tried to keep me away from my dad, but I always knew he loved me and wanted to be with me. Before the divorce, my dad and I used to fish, camp, and hike regularly. This built a love for the outdoors in me that I'll never forget and never want to. So when I decided to live in the woods, it felt like the natural choice. I was 18 when I couldn't stand Steve's overbearing attitude any longer. Even though he didn't have a job most of the time, he expected me to be up by 8 a.m. every day, even though I worked 5 days a week. I had been saving up since my junior year to get my own place, and getting away from Steve and my mom was a priority. I quit school after the first semester of my senior year and got my GED instead. My dad wasn't thrilled about it, but he understood and signed the necessary papers. On my days off, I felt like I'd earned the right to sleep in, but Steve disagreed. One day, he barged into my room yelling for me to get up, and I told him to leave me alone. He acted like he was going to hit me, so I knocked him down first. At that moment, I knew he'd call the cops, so I packed my things and left quickly, never to return. With no plan and no car, I wandered around town for hours. As the sun began to set, I found a small patch of woods on the edge of town, walked in far enough to be hidden from the road, and made camp. I built a fire and threw together a bed from my clothes and leaves. That first night wasn't too bad, but I didn't intend for this to be long-term. I thought I'd easily find an empty place to crash in until I could save enough money, but it didn't turn out that way. The decent spots were either secured or run by gangs who used them for things like drug use. After a few days of this, I realized living with Steve would have been better than staying in those places. Another weekend was approaching, and I prioritized sleep and safety, so I returned to my little forest camp. Sleeping on the ground wasn't a long-term solution, so by midweek, I went to a local store and bought a few essentials, the most important being a sleeping bag. This small investment improved my situation a lot. I also built a simple lean-to shelter using a tarp and lined it with foil to reflect heat from the fire, which made the cold nights more bearable. I cleaned up in public bathrooms and did my laundry at a 24-hour laundromat, where I occasionally spent the night. My bosses noticed my hygiene slipping, but they never said anything directly. Eventually, I found a small river near my camp where I could bathe regularly. Overall, things were better than they could have been, mainly because I had a job. But it wasn't ideal. My patch of woods was cut in half by railroad tracks, and hobos would sometimes pass through, setting up their own camp a short distance away. I first found the hobo camp by accident while using the railroad tracks as a quiet route to avoid being seen by the police. I didn't want them bothering me since I was still technically underage. One evening, I saw the glow of a fire and heard voices. Curious, I crept closer and saw 3 older men sitting around the fire. I watched and listened for a while before deciding they weren't a threat. I called out to them, and after sizing me up, they invited me down to join them. We sat for hours sharing stories. I told them my name was Steve and that I lived nearby, which sparked a long conversation about their lives and my own situation. At some point, they offered me some fortified wine, which wasn't great, but I grew to like it. As fall approached, the temperature dropped, and with it came some rougher visitors to the hobo camp. By then, I had become somewhat accepted into the group. We spent many cool evenings by the fire, listening to the new guys' stories and passing around bottles. One of the new arrivals was an older man named Red, who became more aggressive as he drank. One night, after something I said, Red attacked me and I ended up on the ground being kicked. The others managed to stop him long enough for me to escape. After that, I kept my distance whenever strangers were around. But it wasn't a stranger who caused the next issue. A guy I thought I could trust tricked me. His betrayal was what pushed me to finally get my own apartment. The memory of Red was fading, but staying warm and fed took up most of my focus. Despite being a homeless teen, I somehow managed to get a promotion at work, which came with a raise. That extra money made survival easier. One Saturday, I was collecting wood when a guy around my age approached me. His name was Ryan, and he had just arrived from Kansas City. We talked a bit, and I told him about the camp. We went our separate ways, but later that night, we continued our conversation by the fire. Over the next 2 days, we spent our evenings together with the rest of the guys, sharing stories. Everything seemed fine until I accidentally mentioned it was payday. I had always been secretive about my money, hiding it in various places. But Ryan had been watching me closely and figured out I hadn't stashed my cash. He asked to borrow some money, and when I said I didn't have any, he called me a liar and pulled out a knife. I was terrified, but losing nearly $1,000 scared me more. I kept up the lie as long as I could before I broke down and begged. Ryan's expression turned evil, and I knew he wouldn't hesitate to hurt me. Just as I turned to run, he slashed my arm. Panicking, I backed up the hill while watching Ryan. Just then, another figure appeared behind him and knocked him down. It was one of the regulars, Mike, holding his trusty axe handle. He'd been watching Ryan all night and had suspected something. Mike told Ryan to leave, and he did, vanishing into the night. I didn't see him again. That incident was my breaking point. I had saved up enough for a place by then, and I spent the weekend looking through ads. By Sunday evening, I was in my very own apartment. It was small and run down, but it was mine. A few months later, I found a better place and stayed there for 3 years. I still think about Mike and the others sometimes. They weren't what most people would expect from that lifestyle. Even though they were good guys, camping or living rough isn't something I'd recommend to anyone. About 12 years ago, most of the events I'll share began, though the story isn't quite finished yet. It's around 2010, and I'm still living with my parents. We moved into this area when I was about 14. Not long after that, I found the woods across the street. I ended up making them my safe place, mostly because of the bullying I faced and the chaos at home. This neighborhood didn't have many kids, and the few there were happened to be older. All the tension made me a very anxious kid, and any free time I had was spent alone. One day, curiosity got the best of me, and I wandered into the woods. There didn't seem to be anyone else around, which oddly made me feel safe, a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. I found a small clearing surrounded by cedar trees, which became my secret spot, like a clubhouse. Over time, I started spending more and more time there. I even accidentally fell asleep and stayed out there one night. I thought my parents would freak out, but they hadn't even noticed. That was all the motivation I needed to make this place my camping spot. At first, I wasn't missed when I stayed out there, so I knew I needed camping gear. I tried bringing stuff from home, but it didn't last long. Asking my parents for money was not an option. I started knocking on doors, offering to mow lawns. I had never mowed a lawn before, but that didn't seem to matter. The real challenge was finding a lawnmower. I'd sneak my dad's mower out, but eventually, I got caught and took a beating for it. Luckily, by then, I had saved enough money to buy a cheap, broken-down mower of my own. Took all the money I had, but at least I wasn't sneaking around anymore. Once I had saved up some more money, I rode my barely working bike 5 miles to this rundown army surplus store. I left with an old backpack stuffed with gear I thought I'd need. I was so excited to try everything out that I skipped a whole week of school and camped out in my clubhouse. It became a hobby, but it was more than that for me. It was my only source of safety and happiness for several years. I barely went to school, just enough to avoid trouble, and I would head straight to the woods every day after class. By then, I considered the woods mine. Anyone else who came through was an intruder in my mind. And when that day came, I didn't hesitate to act. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had been camping all weekend and was walking down the usual path to the creek for water. Across the creek, about 50 yards away, was a nearly deserted road. I rarely saw anyone using it, but that day I saw a camper parked there. 2 men were walking in and out of it, not noticing me at all. When I came back a few hours later, they were still there, now drinking beer and shooting guns without a care in the world. This made me furious, but when a stray bullet hit the water near me, I had enough. I ran all the way home and called the sheriff. I thought my call was anonymous, but now I'm not so sure. I made up a story about getting lost and stumbling upon the men. I even lied and said they had threatened me with their guns. I know now how wrong that was, but back then, I was just angry and young. The next morning, while getting ready for school, I heard a news report about a major drug bust. Apparently, the sheriff had acted on an anonymous tip and found 2 men shooting guns on a country road. After further investigation, the camper turned out to be a mobile meth lab. Both men were arrested, awaiting bail hearings. I knew this was because of the call I made, and it scared me, but I felt safe knowing no one could connect me to it. For about a year, I followed the case. Then, 3 months before the sentencing, I received an anonymous letter. It simply said, "You messed with the wrong people, kid." A wave of fear shot through me, but I tried to convince myself it wasn't from those men. That is, until I got another letter the following week. This one was clearer. "You better hope we get time served." At that point, I didn't care how they found out it was me. It no longer mattered. The letters kept coming. When their hearing finally arrived, the outcome wasn't good. Both men were felons with multiple firearm charges. Add the drug manufacturing charge, and they were facing at least 10 years. But the judge wasn't feeling lenient. He sentenced both men to 20 years. I was sure my days were numbered after that. I stopped going to school altogether and stayed in the woods. I knew it wouldn't really keep me safe, but if I was going to die, I wanted it to happen in a place I loved. Oddly enough, nothing happened. Month after month passed, and I became more confident it had all been a bluff, just an attempt to scare me. Life went on, and the last decade has been full of ups and downs. The men were the last thing on my mind until last week. Out of nowhere, another anonymous letter arrived at my apartment. It read, "You better write a will. The end is near." I dropped it like it was on fire. My girlfriend was with me and saw it. She picked it up and read it, looking worried. I brushed it off as a prank, refusing to explain anything. And just like that, a ghost from my past showed up in my present. You can probably imagine how this has affected me. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid those men might target my girlfriend or our newborn. Going to the police crossed my mind, but without proof, I know there's not much they can do. My options seem limited. With no one else to talk to, I'm sharing my story anonymously online. I'm not sure why, maybe just for the anonymity of it. All I can say is, be careful of the choices you make when you're young. Wish me luck, and please pray for my family. In the late spring of 2018, I finally set out on my long-awaited camping trip to the Western Wilderness. The trip had been in the planning stages for over a year and was my first chance to camp with firearms. The drive to the area was enjoyable, and I learned a lot about that part of the country that I hadn't known before. Upon arrival, I parked my SUV and let my contact know I had made it safely. We reviewed my plan one last time before I began the long hike to my campsite. That first day went quietly. The weather was perfect, and I ended up sleeping under the stars by my campfire. The sense of freedom was invigorating compared to all the restrictions back home. The next day was similar. I hiked at a relaxed pace, soaking in the wildlife around me. Around 2 p.m., I found the spot I had aimed to camp at. A quick glance told me I'd made a smart choice. Soon enough, my campsite was set up, and I started cooking lunch. After eating, I felt myself getting sleepy but decided to do some shooting instead, which was a big part of why I was there. I found a dry riverbed about 150 yards from camp that seemed like a safe spot to shoot. After setting up some steel targets, I started firing. The joy I felt was hard to describe, like I was living a life of old pioneers. After going through a box of ammo and reloading my rifle, I suddenly heard gunfire echoing through the hills. My curiosity took over, and I set out to find the source of the shots. It sounded like multiple guns, which made me uneasy. I decided to head back to camp, thinking the shooters wouldn't welcome an outsider. It's a decision I still question but also feel grateful for. Back at camp, I started thinking about dinner. The shooting had stopped shortly after I returned, and I assumed the people had moved on. After spending about an hour cleaning my rifles, I stretched out by the fire, catching myself dozing off. I didn't feel like cooking much, so I snacked on some crackers and cheese before heading to bed. The sun dipped behind the trees, and I took it as a signal to turn in early. Sometime in the night, a noise woke me up. Startled, I peeked out of my tent but saw nothing. Figuring it was just my imagination, I laid back down. Just as I was about to fall asleep again, I heard a blood-chilling scream. It was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard, second only to a rabbit being killed by a predator. The scream came again, followed by a woman's desperate cries for help. At that moment, reality hit hard, and I was paralyzed by fear. What was I supposed to do? I considered grabbing my rifle and running into the dark, but the sounds were coming from the same direction as the earlier gunfire. Common sense prevailed, and I stayed put. One more scream echoed through the night, followed by a single gunshot. I stayed frozen in fear until sunrise, unsure of what to do. The next morning, all my feelings of freedom were gone, replaced by a sense of impending doom. I packed my gear faster than I ever had and began the hike back to civilization. A trip that had taken a day and a half to get there took less than a day to return. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, clutching my rifle tightly, expecting someone to be following me. I finally made it back to my truck just after dark and headed home, relieved to be leaving that place behind. As the relief faded, guilt began to set in. I had heard what sounded like a woman being attacked, possibly killed, and I did nothing. The entire drive home was a mental tug-of-war. One moment I was calling myself a coward, and the next I was telling myself there was nothing I could have done, being outnumbered and in the dark. Both thoughts were true. I was terrified, but running out into the unknown would have been foolish. Yet, the sting of guilt lingers. The question that haunted me was whether I should report what I had heard. But I hadn't really witnessed anything, just some screams and gunshots out in the wilderness. Without solid evidence, I would have been nothing more than a burden to the authorities. That was my punishment, living with the shame of choosing logic over decency. Months later, I found out what had happened. It turned out I had been camping about a mile away from an outlaw motorcycle gang. They had shown up earlier that day to shoot illegal firearms at their usual spot. Tragically, they had also kidnapped a woman who had been hiking in the area. After hours of horrific abuse, they released her. The screams I had heard must have been her cries for help before they shot and left her for dead. Miraculously, she survived. She managed to reach the highway and find help, spending a week in the hospital before being released. The gang members knew they were caught and ended up striking deals that would keep them in prison for most of their lives. I was relieved to learn the woman had lived, but the thought of what might have been still haunts me. I never told anyone about this incident, and sharing it now under an anonymous account means I probably never will. If you think I'm a coward after reading this, I don't blame you. I didn't tell this story for judgment, but for those who believe staying out of other people's business is the safest choice. I understand that now. Many have suffered for doing the right thing, and if you help someone in need, your life might be upended. But from experience, I can tell you that the guilt of doing nothing is far worse. We're all on this earth together, and if we can, we should help each other in times of need. Imagine yourself in their shoes. You might be the only person standing between them and death. When I was younger, I always wanted to join a local camping group. At the time, it was still a well-respected organization that taught useful outdoor skills. I think I was around 11 when I finally convinced my mom to let me sign up. She was hesitant at first because, back in her home country, groups like these were often used as military training for kids. I asked the leader to have a chat with her, and after many questions, her worries were put to rest. With that obstacle gone, I became a part of the group. Unfortunately, I quickly realized that the camping club in my area wasn't like what I had imagined. Our leader was an anxious single mom with little enthusiasm, and it left me feeling disappointed. 6 months later, a small glimmer of hope appeared. A scout leader from a nearby town invited our group on a camping trip. This was one of the main reasons I had joined in the first place. I loved camping with my family, but since my parents had separated, we hadn't gone on any trips. Early on a Saturday morning, the leader picked us up and drove us to the campsite. There were only about 9 kids in total. He gathered us together and explained how to set up our tents. Each tent housed 2 boys, but since the numbers were uneven, I got one to myself. One by one, the leader directed us and we began pitching our tents. Some needed help, but overall, the process went smoothly. The rest of the morning was spent learning first aid and general safety. I was paired with the leader, becoming the example for the next few hours, wrapped in bandages and carried on a makeshift stretcher. It was fun and, as I'd later find out, quite useful. Once the first aid training was done, we had lunch and took a short break. By around 3 in the afternoon, we were gathered for archery lessons. I was thrilled. Ever since watching my first adventure movie, I had dreamed of using a bow. This was my first and probably my last chance for a while. The leader gave us a quick safety briefing before instructing us on how to shoot. Of course, being a group of excited preteens, most of us didn't pay much attention to the safety talk. I was the first to shoot. As I pulled back the string, I crouched down like a warrior from the movies. The leader scolded me and made me stand properly, which took some of the fun out of it. But when my arrow hit the target, I was excited. One by one, the other boys took their turns. Afterward, we were allowed to shoot on our own. Everyone was chatting and trying to outdo the kid next to them. Then it happened. A boy named Kevin was talking to another boy, Chris, standing beside him. Kevin had his arrow notched and the string drawn back, but not all the way. When Chris said something, Kevin turned to face him. Whether Kevin lost his grip or released the string intentionally and lied about it later, the arrow shot forward, hitting Chris in the chest, and it went in about 8 inches. Panic erupted. The leader immediately called for the first aid kit. Chris was in shock and struggling to breathe. There wasn't much the leader could do other than pack the area around the wound and try to keep Chris calm. 2 boys were sent running to the ranger station, which was about half a mile away. The rest of us stood around in stunned silence, all except for Kevin, who kept pacing and muttering, "I'm sorry," over and over until the leader told him to be quiet. The ambulance arrived about 20 minutes later, though it felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. The trip ended abruptly. We quickly packed up and went home. On the ride back, Kevin's guilt seemed to hit him hard, and I can still hear his cries in my mind. I always saw it as a horrible accident, but some of the others had a different story. One boy claimed that Chris had insulted Kevin, calling him a name no one our age wanted to hear, and that Kevin had shot him out of anger. Only Kevin knows the truth, and he's never spoken about it since. The next morning, I learned Chris had been rushed into surgery, which went well. The arrow had pierced his left lung, narrowly missing his heart by an inch. Thankfully, he made a full recovery. Kevin, of course, was the most relieved. Everyone agreed it was an unfortunate accident, and no charges were pressed. A few months later, Kevin formally apologized to Chris, who accepted it, and as far as I know, there's no lingering resentment. As for me, I didn't escape completely unscathed. Once my mom heard about the accident, my time in the scouting group was over. I wasn't too upset, though. I took up BMX biking instead, which, looking back, might have been the safer choice. The story takes place in the summer of 2006. For the past few years, I've been hiking the paths of a nearby national park. The hour-long drive there was as smooth as it had always been. After arriving, I parked near the visitor center and informed the ranger of my hiking plans. After one final check of my gear, I began my 2-mile trek to the usual campsite. Little did I know that someone's life had taken a dark turn, and I would soon be involved. My love for the outdoors started just after the tragic events of September 11th. Although I wasn't at any of the attack locations, I lost someone very dear to me. We had been college sweethearts but lost contact over the years. Thanks to the internet, we reconnected and were planning to meet over Thanksgiving, with hopes of rekindling our relationship. The devastating news of her death shattered me, and I started making plans to end my own life. I even packed a bag and hiked to the spot where I intended to do it. But when I arrived, something changed. The natural beauty around me, even in my deep grief, brought a sense of peace that changed my mind. My mourning lasted a long time, but whenever the sadness became too much, I would escape into nature, where things seemed more bearable. Now, back to the summer of 2006. By then, my trips into the wilderness were routine. Nothing significant happened that first evening. The next morning, I decided to explore the canyons. These hikes often yielded a few artifacts like arrowheads for my growing collection. After a quick oatmeal breakfast, I hit the trail. Almost halfway down the canyon wall, a sudden glimmer caught my eye. I couldn't find the source at first, but another flash quickly blinded me. After regaining focus, I saw a pair of arms waving about 50 feet down the cliffside. I hurried down the trail to get a clearer view. I jumped onto a rocky ledge, but it immediately started to crumble beneath me. The fall felt endless, and I braced for a painful impact. Fortunately, the drop wasn't as bad as I had feared, only about 20 feet. I lay there for a moment, recovering, before remembering why I'd come down in the first place. I tried to stand but realized my left foot was stuck between two rocks. With a push on the top rock and a tug on my leg, I freed myself. Once I was back on my feet, I scanned the area and spotted a woman lying still to my right. She didn't appear to be moving, but as I got closer, I saw her lips begin to twitch. Kneeling beside her, I calmly asked her name. Her eyes slowly opened, and a faint smile appeared. "I thought you were gone when I saw that rock slide," she whispered in a rough but kind voice. "I don't mean to be a bother, sir, but do you have any water?" I quickly rummaged through my pack for my water bottle. It was dented but hadn't leaked. I carefully tilted it to her lips and let her drink just a little, knowing too much could make her sick. Over the next several minutes, she told me how she had ended up there while I gave her small sips of water. She was in severe pain, and I knew we needed help fast. After explaining my plan, I covered her with my fleece jacket and started the climb back up the hill. Climbing back up the unsteady rocks was much harder than coming down. My back was aching, and I could barely manage a brisk walk, let alone a run. Despite the pain, I made it to the ranger station a little after 1 p.m. The ranger was quick, assembling a rescue team within minutes. I was sent to the hospital in an ambulance and ended up staying overnight. Later that evening, around 6 p.m., I saw the hospital staff wheeling her into the ER. The waiting seemed to go on forever, and she was rushed into surgery soon after arriving. It was several more hours before I heard any news. When it finally came, it was good. Despite a punctured lung, concussion, broken arm, and several other injuries, she would fully recover. My own healing journey is another story, but Shannon, as I came to know her, was reunited with her family and eventually built a life of her own. The last I heard, she was living in Montana with her husband and 2 children. I hope she continues to live a long and happy life, and I'm just grateful that I was able to help her when she needed it most. This is something my husband and I experienced last year, right after the quarantine restrictions were lifted in our region. We packed our bags and headed out for a hike at a nearby nature reserve. It was something we used to do quite often before we got married, and I had really missed it. The plan was to hike to a specific lake, camp overnight, and return to the car the next day. It was a bright, warm day, and the trails were dry for the most part. We hadn't seen many people on the trail that morning, which made it feel peaceful. Around midday, we stopped for lunch at a designated campsite, roughly halfway to the lake. Another couple had the same idea. They were already sitting at one of the picnic tables, so we asked if we could join them. We ended up chatting with them for a while. They were newlyweds on their honeymoon, which delighted my husband, who's a hopeless romantic. He started telling them all about how we had met and some other mushy stuff that I usually forget. After about 2 hours, we parted ways and continued on our hike. We reached the lake about an hour before dusk, exhausted and ready for dinner. I got a fire going while my husband, Chris, prepared a small meal. I also set up the tent as he finished cooking. We sat by the fire, made s'mores, and eventually went to bed around 10 p.m. I woke up just before sunrise the next morning and restarted the fire to cook breakfast. Chris handled taking down the tent and packing everything up. Once we were sure the fire was completely out, we headed back down the trail. At around 10 a.m., we reached the halfway point again, but decided not to stop this time. A couple of hours later, we ran into the husband of the couple we had met the day before. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Chris asked where she was, and the man told us she had fallen ill the previous night and had gone home. He seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact when he said it. Before we could ask more, he mentioned that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It sounded odd, but we had no reason not to believe him. At that moment, a group of hikers appeared, and the man quickly excused himself to talk to them. I was curious but didn't want to pry. Their relationship wasn't any of my business. Chris reminded me of our plans for that evening, and we continued on our way. We reached the parking lot shortly after, packed up our gear, and noticed a few people talking nearby as we drove off. Several more cars, including a ranger's truck, were pulling in, but we didn't think much of it. We got home that afternoon, took care of some family matters, and didn't think about the hike again until the next morning. During breakfast, Chris was watching the news when a report came on about a woman who had died while camping. He almost spit out his coffee when they showed her face. It was the woman we had met at the park just 2 days earlier. He called me over to confirm what he was seeing, and when I saw her photo, I was shocked. A wedding photo of the couple then appeared on the screen. Chris turned up the volume. According to the husband, they had been at a popular cliffside lookout to watch the sunrise. While they were preparing to leave, the woman lost her footing and fell hundreds of feet. Sounded plausible, but something about it felt off to me. Why hadn't he mentioned this when we saw him? And what about the story of her being sick? The timeline didn't add up. It couldn't have been more than a few hours since the accident happened, but his behavior made no sense. We passed several hikers that morning, yet no one mentioned anything to us. It all seemed suspicious. Chris and I talked about it for a while, and he agreed something wasn't right. Though I hate to admit it, my gut feeling was telling me there was more to the story. After much discussion, we decided we should contact the authorities handling the case. As far as we knew, the husband wasn't a suspect, at least not publicly. I called the local sheriff's office and shared what we knew. The deputy put me on hold briefly, then returned to say someone might contact us in the future. But nearly a year has passed, and no one has reached out. That's why I'm reaching out to you. What do you think? Both Chris and I feel like something terrible happened, but we don't have any concrete evidence to back it up. Just a gut feeling. Surely, if the police thought we had something important to offer, they would have contacted us by now, right? I don't want to cause trouble for a grieving man, but I also can't shake the feeling that he might have gotten away with something horrible. Should I push further or leave the authorities to handle it?